Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. FATF, Financial Action Task Force, has deemed that Pakistan has missed out on implementing 25 out of its 27 things that it wanted Pakistan to do. And the implications of this and what they have not done and what they should have done, we reach out to our Pakistan security expert, Abhijit Iyer Mitra. Abhijit, welcome to PGurus channel.
Thank you for having me here once again, Sri. Thanks.
So, Abhijit, what is your read on this latest ruling on the FATF meeting that is currently going on in Florida?
So I have two reads on this. First of all, it seems that the IMF loan, which we discussed last time, $6 billion,
yes,
it seems to have been premature, but just as I predicted, the exact targets of what the political give and take that happened over that 6 billion does not seem to be India focused militant organizations. It's clearly someone else. Now, the second part of this is they are meeting starting tomorrow, the 16th, I think. Or is that today?
Saturday. I think it started today.
It started today.
Yeah.
And this is just a preliminary thing where they'll warn Pakistan of a downlisting in October. And in October, they'll decide to downlist it completely. Now, the problem here, of course, is that there are 3 countries that are very inimical to India on that FATF. And they will ultimately, at some point, be persuaded to vote against it. The quorum there for blocking is 3. And in this case, I suspect China, Malaysia, and Turkey will block the passage of any further downgrading of Pakistan.
Now, I have a question for you. Which are the list of countries that are on this FATF committee? And I have a follow-up after that. Please, if you can let our viewers know who are the members right now.
So it's a whole host of members. I can't list them all out off the top of my head. The ones that a lot of European countries, basically countries from every continent, major countries from every continent that have an interest in this. But as far as I'm concerned, our biggest backers here will be Europe and America. America more so than Europe, because Europe's in this for, well, Europe. Everybody's in this for themselves, basically. But for me, the 3 problem countries will always be China, Malaysia, and Turkey.
Now, China and Malaysia, let's just take one at a time. Turkey, I don't know, in the sense that Turkey probably still feels that they should be ruling India, which is a hubris from First World War. It's got years now since they have even laid claim to some part of the continent around the world. Now, Malaysia, it has about 10% Indian population, or people of Indian origin. And for some strange reason, they seem to have veered more Islamist in the last few decades. I don't think Zakir Naik alone could have done this. There has been some, well of shift towards this, isn't it? What can you just walk our viewers through what has been happening in Malaysia? Because I've seen some horrific scenes of Muslims attacking a Hindu temple at the night, and then 15 people were arrested. I don't know what happened after that. And I've been in touch with some friends from Malaysia who most of Hindu origin. They're all afraid. They're really, really afraid. This Dara Hua Musalman actually has Dara Hua Hindu is very applicable to Malaysia. We will take it in a different case. But why do you think Malaysia has been doing what it has been doing? Mahathir Mohamad, I thought, was a Kerala Hindu converted into Muslim.
So, beware the fanaticism of the convert. The convert is always much more fanatic than the born Muslim.
Of
and
course,
in this case,
who can forget Aurangzeb? His mother was Hindu. Please continue.
But in this one's case, the problem is Malaysia has never actually been secular. It was secular up to a point, and then Singapore decided to leave Malaysia precisely because they didn't like all this Malay Bhumiputra policies. You know, that whole Bhumiputra thing, right? It's basically Malays who are Muslims get first priority because you look at it both in Malaysia, they can't do without affirmative action. And in Singapore, in spite of what little affirmative action they get, they're still the most depressed community. So there's been a constant reinforcing of Malay ethnicity, which at some point during, I'd say, the 80s, even under Mahathir Mohamad in his first term, but certainly pushed by Anwar Ibrahim, who was the real Islamist in all of that, they basically enacted this thing where Bhumiputra would be synonymous with Islam. Right. And since then, there has been no returning from that drift. Now, remember, it's a bit unfair to blame Mahathir and Anwar Ibrahim for it, because even before that, people say that Tunku Abdul Rahman was all this secular, complete nonsense, right? They all used to play Islamist identity politics, probably less so than Anwar Ibrahim and Mahathir Mohamad did. And Mahathir and Anwar just took it to the next level. They brought out, ultimately, what these two chaps confirmed was exactly what Lee Kuan Yew feared, that Malaysia, the Malaysian-Singapore Union, would turn into a majoritarian Islamist state. That is what Lee Kuan Yew foresaw in the 60s. That is why he broke Singapore away. And everything Malaysia does now is just a reaffirmation of what Singapore said it would do, what Lee Kuan Yew said it would do in the 1960s.
I must caution our viewers that there is a slight difference in the demographic composition of Singapore versus Malaysia. Singapore is a Chinese ethnic majority, whereas Malaysia, there are 7 kings who are, who take turns becoming the provincial head of government, so like the titular head of the government, and then there is an elected body. Now, in Singapore, I believe the Hindu percentage is still around 10%. And I think it's 70% Chinese and 20% Malay. I could be wrong about the numbers, but I'm very sure that Chinese constitute the majority in Singapore. Now, Singapore is, to me, a first world country. I mean, I've seen that city and it's beautiful, the way they do things. And they are, in fact, in the next generation of financing, which is going to be fintech, they are probably the leader, if not the leader, already. And so now, what is the problem with Malaysia wanting to support Pakistan?
This isn't just a problem with Malaysia, though I think the Malay angle is much more ethnic. I remind you that even in the 65 war, Indonesia sent its submarines, and this was Sukarno at that point of time, allegedly our friend and co-founder of the non-aligned movement in Ladida. He sent his submarines to support Pakistan.
Sorry. Well, Sukarno and Nehru had similar tastes. Please continue.
Yeah, exactly. So, they sent their submarines to support Pakistan in the 1965 war. And the reason was that this was when Sukarno had started his confrontasi policy, which was basically claiming that all Malays were one. I mean, Malays, Indonesians were one. Everything should be annexed and confront everyone. And they had territorial claims to the Nicobar and Andaman Islands. So people don't realize this, but at one point, Indonesia and India were almost at a state of near war over the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And this was when the Pakistan-India 1965 war broke out. With Malaysia, the more this ethnic issue has grown, it's been an identifier that Islam over being Malay. Initially, it was Bhumiputra meant being Malay and a linguistic identity. Then it became Malay, the ethno-linguistic religious identity. And therefore, you tend to be much more religious and you support your co-religionists across the world. In this case, it becomes Pakistan.
Abhijit, you bring up an excellent point. See, when I was a student in a university in United States as a master's student, and I had a teaching assistant role, and I used to see a lot of students from Malaysia come, and many of them were not Muslim. I mean, there were some who already wear the burqa. There were a lot of Christians also. Now, are Christians also finding the going tough in Malaysia?
From what I can see, so I haven't been to Malaysia in a very long time, and I can honestly tell you I haven't really had Malaysian friends. So I don't really know. But from what I've seen at conferences and things like that, what I've seen is I see almost no Indian Malays anymore. I see no Christian Malays anymore. And amongst the Muslim Malays out there, I see a massive increase in religiosity, open, overt religiosity.
That's really unfortunate. And to fan the flames.
And sorry, just to clarify, I have lots of Pakistani friends who wear the hijab, who have taken the hijab, even though their families haven't forced them. And I can absolutely confirm that it was their own will, and it was actually done in face of family opposition. And a lot of these ladies that I know have done it out of piety. It isn't political Islam at work. It's because they were religious people themselves, and they don't let their religion come in the way of their political views. Now, we should always be distinguish between piety, non-political piety, and piety for the sake of political gain. And in Malaysia, what I've invariably seen is overt religiosity purely for political gain, which is very dangerous.
So Malaysia might oppose, and China. Now, China is, in fact, clamping down. That's the only word I can say on its Islamists, Uyghurs, and so on and so forth. So to them, Islamist forces, terrorism presents a real and present danger. So why would China want to vote against India?
So sometime in 2008, 2009, 2010, we can't really delineate when exactly this happened, but they took a strategic decision that they will see Islam as a force multiplier, radical Islam as a force multiplier. And they've been using that ever since. So even in Afghanistan, for example, they had an opportunity to calm things down. They refused to calm it down. They basically played B team to Pakistan and allowed Pakistan to wreak havoc out there. Even at that time, they realized that because of the internet and things like that, and because of this primacy of Arab interpretation, their own Muslim population, the more interconnected it got with the rest of the world, would tend to Arabize. For example, Uyghur Muslims were never Arab Muslims. They were Turkic Muslims who had their own ethos, their own sensibilities, and so on and so forth. And yet what you see now is a homogenization and Arabization of Islam. And the Chinese were probably the first to see that, and they very clearly made up their minds that they were going to take very harsh action against this kind of homogenization. So in their mind, they see absolutely no dichotomy between, on one hand, creating the biggest modern set of concentration camps we've seen in the 21st century, holding upwards of over 1 million people. And what is scary is they're not just throwing Uyghurs in there, they're also throwing the Chinese Hui, which is the integrated Muslim minority, who do not have Muslim names, who are not Turkic. They are Chinese converts to Islam. Even they are now being thrown into concentration camps and being made to conform. And they see absolutely no dichotomy with this. In fact, the more you see them use political Islam against India, the more you'll see them crack down on their own Muslim population.
What a dichotomy there. Now, for viewers' interest, Turkey is a very interesting study. In 1918, after they lost the First World War, essentially they became a lot smaller than what they were. They lost control over the complete Arabia land, what ended up becoming, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and so on and so forth. Then a reformer by the name of Kamal Pasha, he was one of the generals who actually won one battle against the British, which was controlled by Winston Churchill, and that was held against Churchill for a long time. Anyway, so Kamal Pasha introduced modernity into Turkey. He moved away from the caliphate. He tried to make Turkey a democracy, and things were fine up until Erdogan came to power. And Erdogan initially did good, I think, and because he arrested a lot of corrupt generals, he crippled the army, took the control back into the administration, and lately he has been accused of stealing elections. And as that has happened, and there was also accusations that the United States tried to interfere, foist their candidate on Turkey in the recently concluded elections, and so on and so forth. There was even a coup. Anyway, that's written in detail in PGurus, by the way. I don't know how many of you have been following the international political geopolitics that we had covered. But my question to you, I'm sorry to have this long-winded explanation before coming to the question. Why is Erdogan leaning more Islamic now?
So I'm going to disagree with a lot of what you said, because my own study of Turkey is actually quite different. So remember, the Turks have always been, the Turkic tribes, ever since about, say, the Gupta Empire, the Turkic tribes have been the determinant of geopolitics in Asia and Europe. Because, there was this huge empire that nobody talks about, called the Göktürk Empire, that controlled everything between the Caspian Sea and the Sea of Japan. And nobody even knows about this empire.
You're
It was
talking
the
about
second.
Genghis Khan and others?
No, well before Genghis Khan.
Okay.
Well before Genghis Khan. This was around 880, because, the Huns were also Turks, and they
Yes.
were the ones that came. The Kushans were Turks. So all of these were Turkic empires. We were ruled by Kushans at one point, and they were a Turkic empire. The Huns, for example, Toroman was a great Shiva Bhakta. So the Turks at one point, they've gone through their Buddhist phase, they've gone through their Hindu phase. Now we're going through the Muslim phase. In about 800, they all came together and formed something called the Göktürk Empire, which went from the Caspian all the way to the almost up to the Sea of Japan, certainly till Korea. Now, the thing is, they've always had this, the modern Turks have always had this sense of the loss of empire. So ever since, if you look at what we call Muslim history, about when does the Prophet come about? 600 AD. So out of 1,400 years, only 250 years have been written by Arabs. The rest of Muslim history, even in Arabia and North Africa, the remaining 1,150 years has been written by Turkic tribes. At one point, for almost 400 years in between, the official name of Egypt was Turkey. It used to be the Turkey of its days in the 1200s and things like that. So the old Turkish Empire was all the way from North Africa to the Sea of Japan. That is the extent of Turkic expansion that we saw. Then the Ottoman Empire just made it a Mediterranean empire. And when it collapsed, all the talk under Erdogan was of a new Turkic empire, which would be Turkey all the way to the Sea of Japan. Now, what does Erdogan himself represent? When Kemal Atatürk supposedly modernized Turkey, now let's be clear, he did not modernize Turkey at all. This is all just concocted nonsense, because he had a very colorful sex life. He basically made the Turks cut off their beards, adopt Western clothes, dance, have waltzes and foxtrots in public, and that was the extent of his modernization. He was a horrible tyrant. He was a dictator. He was a genocidaire. He started the first Kurdish genocides and so on and so forth. So I think attributing any kind of liberalism or democracy to him is nonsense. So the second part of this was, what he did was he forcibly imposed a Western veneer on what was a rural, highly conservative old Ottoman Turkey. And when you impose something from the top, that social consensus is never generated. The industrialization of Turkey only begins in the 70s. That is when you had this mismatch between a conservative core population, an imposed Western lifestyle coming together. And that is what strengthened the forces of Islam, because what they saw was that it was when the military regime installed by Kemal Atatürk was declining that Turkey started going up, 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 and up economically. So they saw this as a reaffirmation of the old Ottoman Islamic ways, and that is the force that Erdogan represents. So if you look at his electorate, it's mostly the impoverished internal Turkey, rural Anatolia and things like that, which see the rise of Turkey as fundamentally being a subset of an Islamic resurgence. That's what he represents.
Now, that's an interesting take. However, to the world, at least, see, this is again, there could have been a Romila Thapar in describing Turkish history too, but that's okay. We'll leave that for the viewers to judge. Now, my more core question is, now there is a new axis being formed. Turkey, Russia, and Iran, and they're trying to control the Middle East politics, especially Syria and Iraq, and the regions around it. Because remember that there is the Kurds who are partly in Iraq and partly in Turkey, and they want their own empire. They're sitting on a lot of oil, and likewise there are other pockets. Syria is in fact the one country that does not have any oil deposits, so it usually is like collateral damage. I'm sorry to say this thing. Poor guys, they're almost always treated like collateral damage. But so, do you think Russia is going to, keep quiet as Turkey starts becoming more and more Islamic?
it's a very, I think Russia's resigned to its fate. It's seen the whole of southern Russia go up in flames of Islamism. And I don't think the Russians have any other option, because they're at the end of their tether in Syria. I've spoken to a lot of Russian troops coming out of there, and they seem completely demoralized. Now, I was too young to remember if they're demoralized coming out of Afghanistan. I suspect they were, but you can see the demoralization and the fatigue setting in, because they don't understand what they're fighting for. And preventing Islamism in an external country is an esoteric goal for the Russians. Putin may see it, but the average Russian doesn't see it. And how long can you sustain an external war? I think ultimately what's going to happen there is the history of Islamism is that the answer to the failure of Islamism is never less Islamism, it's always more Islamism. That the new dispensation claims that the last dispensation wasn't Islamic enough. I mean, how much more Islamic do you want to get? And it's a toxic downward cycle. Will Russia accept Turkey becoming more Islamic? I don't think Russia has any other option. They've already created a sort of quasi-pseudo alliance with Erdogan. You remember at one point when Erdogan shot down 2 Russian planes on the Syrian border,
yes,
the relations plummeted.
Yes.
Today, they're the best of friends. They both hate America. Turkey is buying a Russian missile system, an anti-aircraft missile system, the same one that was used to threaten the Turks over Syria. And there's an alliance of convenience with the Iranians because of the Kurdish issue, right? Because the Kurds sit on the biggest reserve of oil and gas anywhere on earth.
Right.
So they'll always prevent, and it's split between Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. So there's always that interest. But there's a lot of micro interests out there, because notice the way Turkey has shifted in its who it supports, who it doesn't support in Syria, who it supports and doesn't support even in Iraq. And, the Turks have this very quaint idea of good Kurd, bad Kurd. Good Kurd is Kurds who help them out against their own Kurds, such as sometimes the Iraqi government and a few Syrian Kurds. And those who don't help them out are bad Kurds. So basically, Turkic Kurds are bad Kurds. Kurds outside Turkey are kind of oscillate between good Kurds and bad Kurds, depending on who they support.
Now, what is the Islamic composition of Turkey? Are they Shias or Sunnis?
They're hardcore Sunni. There's hardly any Shias there.
But then how are they cohabiting with Iran? Sorry to cut you off.
So this is a historical fight, the Ottoman Empire was the Sunni bastion, and the Safavid Empire, and before the 1500s, Iran was a Sunni country. It was the Safavid Empire that forcibly, viciously, brutally converted that country into a Shia country. Before that, Iran was always Sunni. And what happened was it became this ideological, there's the Battle of Chaldiran fought in 1500 and something, which marks the boundary between Sunni Turkey and Shia Iran. And you know what the funny thing is? The Safavids were Turks. So it wasn't seen as a civilizational battle between the Persians and the Turks. It was seen as an intra-Turkic battle of Sunnis and Shias. And that is where the boundary was settled, and mentally it settled the boundary for them. So that was one thing that happened. The second thing was they've always had different spheres of interest. So one good thing that Kemal Atatürk did was he reoriented Turkey towards the West. He gave up on all Eastern interests because he simply wasn't interested in the East. He was more interested in the West. And the Shah of Iran became much more interested towards Russia and controlling the Persian Gulf and so on and so forth to the south. So it was a natural progression of things which consolidated the results of the Battle of Chaldiran in 1500 and something, I forget now. But there was a second aspect to this. Kemal Atatürk, everybody says he made Turkey secular. He did not. He actually institutionalized Hanafi Islam as Turkic Islam. Not Salafism, but Hanafism is the official Turkic form of Islam. What was secular, though, was the definition of what a Turk is in the constitution. As per the Turkish constitution, your religion doesn't matter. If you feel Turkish, you are Turk. That's it.
That's a very wide swath that they're trying to cut there. But this is just interesting. These are probably these are coming together for convenience, for some specific thing. But I think at the heart of all this lies the oil of the Kurdistan, which is what you mentioned. Now, so what is the FATF a majority vote or a unanimous vote that is required to act against Pakistan?
It's a majority. It's a unanimous vote, and unfortunately, if 3 countries say no, it acts as an effective veto, which is why you have Pakistan, Turkey, Malaysia, and China, who will be the biggest underminers. There'll also be, let me read this out, there'll be Hong Kong, which is a part of China, which gets a separate vote. So that's 4 votes already. So even if somebody persuades Malaysia to not vote, you still have China, Hong Kong, and Turkey voting against it. You have the Gulf Cooperation Council that gets 1 vote, thankfully, but I don't know how they're going to vote. And out of the rest of the countries, these will only be the problem countries. The problem is, however, that China has 4 votes. Well, Pakistan has 4 votes now. China, Hong Kong, Turkey, and Malaysia. Even if you break away 1, the other 3 won't be broken away.
Yeah, I think you'll always have some vested interest trying to go one way or the other in terms of voting. But I think the fact that Pakistan's feet are being held to the fire under the FATF, by the FATF itself is news, because this has never come out in the past. So the more important thing, Abhijit, is there is a new world order emerging in terms of trying to track financial flows. KYC, know your client, and then you have the AML, anti-money laundering, and then you have the additional thing now called KYCC, know your client's client. In other words, you may have made money legally, and you may have paid taxes on the money you made. However, if you got money from a dubious source, then also you are under the scanner. So US is reaching deep into these sources of funding. And I don't know how that is going to play out in all these things.
So not deep enough. So here's the thing. The Americans have taken action against, say, the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland over illegal bank accounts. But here's the thing. Look at 2 countries that have never suffered a terrorist attack in their existence. Singapore and the UAE. Guess why? Because they're the primary centers of terrorist money laundering. And no terrorist will ever attack the UAE or Singapore, because their thing is you're killing the goose that lays golden eggs. So I'm waiting for the crackdown on till the crackdown on UAE and Singapore as financial hawala hubs happens. You're not actually seeing a seriousness in tackling terror financial flows.
That's a new target that we have not heard of before. At least I have not heard before. A very, very interesting conversation. Always a pleasure talking to you, Abhijit. I'm sure we're going to come back and talk more about this in the days and weeks to come. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
And viewers, do not forget to click on the subscribe button, which is a bell on your YouTube window. Please do. We need your help. About 55 to 60% are still new viewers. We would like you to subscribe so that you will get notification of our videos. We are putting up 2 to 3 videos every day. So there's a wealth of information being shared. There is no noise. It's always news. And with experts such as Abhijit, who seems to be knowing a lot of stuff. I mean, I feel like every time I have a conversation with you, Abhijit, I realize how brilliant a person you are, a thinking mind. And I hope to make full use of it with your help. Thank you very much.
Mika Nandri.
That's thank you very much in Tamil.